this session is going to be on understanding data. And so I'm really excited to be turning it over to Matt Day. Many of you probably know Matt. He's been with us at the COG for some time and has worked in a lot of our communities. And so he's going to be walking through this concept. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for questions and conversation as we go. So I'll turn it over to you, Matt, and you can get started.
Okay. Can you make it so I can share my screen?
I can. Mm-hmm. You should be good now.
Okay, thank you. Let me pull up the PowerPoint. And can everybody see the slides? All right. So I'm going to talk kind of generally about data today, but data is obviously a very broad subject. So, you know, we can only kind of skirt the very surface of things. You know, if anybody has questions or wants to go into detail on things as we're going along, please feel free to jump right in. We're going to keep this pretty informal. Just as an overview of what I hope you'll get out of this talk today, hopefully you'll have at least a basic understanding of some of the general types of data that are available, what geography we can get that data at, you know, what those sources are, how to access that data, some really brief discussion about how to interpret some data, and then a little bit about what Triangle J can do to help you with your data needs. So just thinking about what are the most important foundational data sets that are out there that we use all the time. I think it should not come as a surprise to anybody that the census really kind of rises to the top as kind of the main data set that we use for all kinds of purposes. And that is not just the every 10-year decennial census results, but that's also all kinds of other products that are put out by the Census Bureau, such as the American Community Survey, American Housing Survey, Economic Census, all kinds of information we can get from the Census Bureau. There's a few other really key ones that we're going to talk about today, one being the Office of State Management and Budget. It's budget management. I put that backwards on the slide, but and the state demographer, who also put out various sort of demographic data, as well as some GIS data sets that we get on the mapping side of things through sources such as GoNC and NC1Map. So we're going to dive right into talking about the census because it's really it's probably the most important of the data sets that we have available to us. And sorry, I'm trying to make sure I can see my whole screen here. So the blocks are the basic bottom smallest level of census geography that we can get data at. And a block, the easiest way to think about it is a block surrounded by streets. That's a very typical block, but there are also other features that the census uses to define the edges of blocks, things like streets, streams, railroads, city boundaries. There's a whole host of things that can make up a block and define its edges, but that is the smallest geography that we can get census data for. Then sort of working up from that, you take a group of blocks, put them together, and that makes something called a block group, which makes sense. And then you take a group of block groups and you put them together, and that makes up something called a census tract. Census tracts will always conform to county boundaries. So if you are a county, you will always have, you can add up all the census tracts within your county and it should match up to your county number. They will not cross a boundary. That is not true when it comes to municipalities. those block group and census tract boundaries do not match up with municipality boundaries, but block boundaries do. Municipalities are treated, the Census Bureau calls them places, and that is because every state calls them a different thing. And so places is sort of the general term that the Census Bureau has come up with to deal with that level of geography. And those places can be either official municipalities, you know, you are the town of XYZ and you have this particular boundary, or they can be what are called census designated places. Those are defined areas that are not incorporated towns, but they're definable communities. And so the Census Bureau works with the local area to define a boundary for what that area should be, and to be able to report data on sort of that general unincorporated area. As I said before, blocks are nested within places. So the city boundary or the census designated place boundary will always be a block boundary. But the block groups and the tracts do not follow those place boundaries. And all of these boundaries get reviewed every 10 years and can and do change from census to census. So just because you were in census tract 201.01 last time does not mean you're still in that census tract the next time around. So just to kind of visualize what this looks like, here's an example for Lee County. Within Lee County, we have two places, the city of Sanford and the town of Broadway. And if you look at the map, you'll see some of these orange places on the map. None of them are in Lee County, but those are census designated places. So for example, Moncure that you see up at the top of the map, that is a CDP that's been defined. I see Commissioner Smith, you have your hand raised.
I think it might have been accidental.
Okay, accidental. So then the county gets divided into census tracts. So you can see what that looks like on the map. And then each of those census tracts gets divided into block groups. There's usually somewhere around 2 to 4 block groups per census tract. It's, you know, they're not all exactly the same size. So there are some differences, but it's somewhere in that ballpark of 2 to 4 block groups per census tract. And then each block group is then broken down into the individual blocks. And all of the maps on this came from the Census Bureau's Tiger website, which is really great in terms of sort of just geographic mapping for census data. Aside from that basic block group tract data, the Census Bureau does also report things in terms of other types of districts. So they provide information by township, which the Census Bureau terms as either county subdivisions or minor civil divisions. You'll see it kind of referenced both ways in different census products. So you can get the township level information. They do also report it by legislative district. And so you do have to look and make sure that you know, they don't update the legislative districts all the time. So you have to make sure that if you're pulling that data, that it's actually pulling the most recent correct legislative districts, but it will tell you which vintage of district lines it's based on. They also report things by metropolitan statistical area and micropolitan statistical area. This is a really complicated topic, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the important thing to understand about MSAs for our area is that we fall in multiple different MSAs. So if you are in Durham, Orange, or Chatham County, then you are in the Durham-Chapel Hill MSA. And if you are in Wake or Johnston County, then you are in the Raleigh-Cary MSA. And if you are in either of those MSAs, then you are also in what's called the Raleigh-Durham-Cary combined statistical area, where they combine those two MSAs together, along with also the Henderson micropolitan statistical area. All those three together is the Raleigh-Durham-Cary CSA. If you are in Lee County, you are in the Sanford micropolitan statistical area. And if you are in Moore County, you're in the Pinehurst Southern Pines micropolitan area. And if you're in either of those, you are also in the Fayetteville, Sanford, Lumberton CSA. So it's very complicated. These boundaries do change quite often. These are actually updated by, it's not the Census Bureau. I think it's the Federal Office of Management and Budget that does these lines, but they do update them fairly regularly, and it's based on commuting patterns for the most part. So it's based on meeting a certain threshold of where the people in your county are commuting to for work. The last one that I want to talk about here is urbanized areas and urban clusters. This is another definition that is developed by the Census Bureau, and it is defined primarily based on population density, although they are considering changing that. They haven't made a decision as of yet, but possibly changing it to base it on housing density instead of population density. But what you see on the screen here is that sort of gray thick line is the outline of, I believe this is the Durham Chapel Hill urbanized area, is the title of the urbanized area. And you can see that the urbanized area is not going to match up exactly with the municipal boundaries. There are areas outside of the municipalities that are in the urbanized area, and there are areas inside the municipalities that are outside the urbanized area. So it is pretty much entirely based on the population density, with a few other factors thrown in as well. So understanding sort of some of the basic geography that you can get census data at, just to get a picture of how this looks in our region. We have obviously 7 counties, but we have 59 places, 80 townships, 457 census tracts, 1,200 block groups, and 32,000 blocks. So you can kind of see there's a big jump there between block groups and blocks in terms of how finely detailed the data is. And as I said before, the boundaries do change. So we did have a pretty big change in the number of census tracts and block groups for our region in the last decade. So in 2010, we had 344 census tracts, but for 2020, we're going to have 457. And that is partly due to growth, and it's partly also just due to trying to shift around some of the census tract boundaries and make more sense and divide things up in a way that made more sense. So those kind of changes do happen every 10 years. Okay, so where are we at sort of in terms of the 2020 census data, which is what everybody wants to know. So right now, the only data that has been released is what's called the apportionment data and the redistricting data. So apportionment data was first, and that is only state level population. So that was the first thing they released, and that was how they determined how many congressional seats each state gets. The second piece that came out was the redistricting data, and that data includes block level information on population count, race and Hispanic Latino origin, housing occupancy, and group quarters population. So we do have block level counts of those 4 data points available through the redistricting data. What we do not have is sort of all the rest of it. but we're expecting to get most of the rest of what we typically use sometime in 2022. So demographic profiles are documents that the Census Bureau puts out, sort of giving a profile of information about all the different sort of high-level data points for different jurisdictions. So like county profiles, municipal profiles, those types of things. Those we expect will come out in 2022. And I'll show you an example of a profile a little later in the presentation. And then we also expect that the full demographic and housing characteristics file, which is for any data wonks out there, is what used to be called the summary file 1. That information should also come out in 2022. So that's where we'll get more information about things like age, sex, household type, household relationship, all the other information we get from the census.
You've got a question, Matt, in the chat. I just want to
Okay.
have it, you answer it before you move on too far.
Okay, let's see. When would you use urbanized areas or urbanized area in discussing analyzing data as opposed to another data grouping, such as MSA? So that is a really great question. So really the difference between urbanized area and MSA is going to come down to the urbanized area is going to be a smaller area than the MSA because it's only going to include the urban portions of that area. Whereas the MSA is going to include a lot of more rural territory that does also have a commuting pattern that goes to the urbanized areas. The other difference is that the urbanized area boundaries are squiggly lines, whereas the MSA boundaries always follow county lines. So it really is going to depend on sort of what you're trying to address. If you're interested in comparing, the size of this city to this other city, I often find that it's more useful to look at something like the urbanized area, because then I'm comparing, this is an actual urban agglomerate. That's a tough word. It's an urban area compared to an urban area. Whereas when you look at MSAs, a lot of it comes down to how the county lines are drawn, and different states do that differently. So when I'm trying to compare, like, say, a city in this state to a city in another state, I'll usually look at urbanized areas. But you'll also find that there's times when it's easier to use MSA, especially if you're trying to look at data that's maybe more of a county level or a regional level type of information rather than just specifically urban. So it's really going to kind of come down to the specifics of what you're trying to address. And then the sort of final item that we should get out of the 2020 census is what's called the detailed demographic and housing characteristics, and that's the former summary file 2 data. It basically is the same information as we get in the summary file 1, just broken down into more detailed categories. The Census Bureau has not announced a release date for that information yet. Okay, so another thing to understand here is that these different data sources are available at different levels of geography. So the redistricting data, as I said, is available down to the block level, but the demographic profiles are only available down to about the place level. So you can get it for a county or a municipality, but you can't get it for a block group. The summary file 1 and summary file 2 data, they haven't announced yet exactly what we'll be getting, but typically that's been available down to the block group and census tract level. In the past, it's been usually available down to the block group. There have been some changes this time around in terms of privacy rules, and there's some question about whether they'll be able to release that at the block group level, or only make it available at the census tract level, and that decision hasn't been made yet. So we're kind of waiting to see on how much detail we can get on those. But when all is said and done and we have all the 2020 census data, what will it tell us? It'll tell us population, age, sex, race, Hispanic, Latino origin, household and family type and relationship, housing count, occupancy of housing, tenure, meaning renting versus owning, and the group quarters population. That is the only information that they collect in the regular census form that you fill out. So where do we get all the rest of the information that we get from the census? About 20 years ago, the Census Bureau started doing something called the American Community Survey. And this is a survey that they conduct on an ongoing rolling basis that they send out to about 1 in every 38 households every year. So on average, you should get this survey about once every 38 years. This replaced the old long form that they used to send out with censuses up until the 2000 census. Back in those days, 1 in every 6 households would receive what was called the census long form that asked all these extra questions. The long form was done away with, and now they use the American Community Survey to collect that information instead. ACS data is released in what is called 1-year data sets and 5-year data sets. So 1-year data is only available for areas with large geographies. So if you are a geography that has at least 65,000 people, you can get 1-year estimates from the ACS. If you fall under that threshold, then you can only get what are called 5-year estimates. And those 5-year estimates take 5 years worth of ACS data and average it together. And that is really due to privacy concerns that they can't, because this is sample data, it's being collected from a relatively small number of people. And so if they released information in 1-year estimates for those small areas, it would make it too easy to be able to figure out like who answered the question. And so for privacy reasons, they have to be able to sort of group those together over 5 years to help sort of mask some of those privacy concerns. The other thing to understand about ACS is that we can only get information down to the block group level. There is no block level data available from this. And as I said, it is a sample, it is not a full count. So they will always also report a margin of error with the data. So they might tell you that the number is 42%, but the margin of error is 4. So that means the real answer could be anywhere between 38% and 46%. But that's sort of what you have to do with sample data. So I'm not going to run through this list because it's long, but this is a list showing all the different types of data you can get from the ACS. And it really kind of falls in 2 main categories. One is about sort of population characteristics, and the other is mainly about housing characteristics. And just one note is that obviously in 2020, there were some things going on in the world that made it a little difficult for them to carry out their typical ACS program. And so the information they collected in 2020, when they tried to look at it, they decided that it wasn't good enough to be able to put out 1-year estimates for that year. So those just aren't available for 2020. Aside from the American Community Survey, there are a handful of other programs that the census does. I'm just checking the chat. I see there's a couple things. I'll get to the question about broadband data in a few minutes. So the American Housing Survey, this is something that the census conducts in odd numbered years, and they do not track nationwide every year. They just do a sample of areas around the country. They do report nationwide numbers, and they report numbers for large MSAs. So for our area, the Raleigh MSA does meet the threshold. But the Durham MSA does not meet the threshold, so we can get this data for the Raleigh side, but not for the Durham side. And there is a separate website where you could get that information from. There's also the economic census. This is something that's conducted every 5 years in years that end in 2 and 7. So there'll be one coming up next year. This is to collect information about business activity and then break it down by industrial sector, NAICS category, all of that kind of information. And it's available at a number of different geographies, generally down to about the county level. Another census-related source is called the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics, which I don't expect you to remember that name, but what I do hope you'll remember is this tool that you see on the left. It's called On the Map, and this is actually a really useful tool that uses this LEHD data set. This is using information that the states report to the census on unemployment insurance and employment and wages data. And it provides information about where people live and where they work so that you can figure out commute flows, work locations, all of those types of things. So looking at the example here on the left, I just ran a really quick query to say, what are the top 10 zip codes that people who live in the town of Wake Forest work in? And it spits out the result and tells me, here's the 10 zip codes, here's where they are, here's the number of people, here's the percentage. You know, it's a very easy to use tool. And the link is here on the screen. And then one last census product that I want to talk about is their population estimates program. They do provide annual estimates of population for states, counties, places, and MSAs. And they base it on birth, death, and migration data. But the thing I want to point out and make sure everybody understands about this is that the Census Bureau and the state demographer have two different methods for doing their annual population estimates. So what you will often see is that if you are, say, working on something related to federal program or federal funding or something like that, then you'll want to use the Census Bureau's population estimate. But if you're working on something that's a state program or state funded, then you'll want to use the state demographer's population estimate. And we'll talk about that one in just a minute. In addition to the census products I just talked about, there are lots of other products. We just don't have time to go through all of them today. So the main way for exploring and gathering census data is this site here called data.census.gov. If you just go to the census's main website, census.gov, you can find your way to this. But if you just went in to get into the data, the quickest way to get there is data.census.gov. And it is it's got a pretty good search tool that I find to be relatively easy for finding quick facts. Make it pretty easy to find information. Now, if you're trying to do something like, I want a spreadsheet of all the population of every block in Chatham County, this isn't a great tool for doing that. You can do it. It's a little clunky for doing that. But if you just want to know, I need to know what is the total number of housing units in Wake County, you can type that in and it'll take you there and get you the answer really quick. So I just want to show you really quickly an example. So I'm going to, when you go to data.census.gov, it brings up this search bar. I'm going to say, I want to know the occupied housing units in Siler City, North Carolina in 2015. And it brings up a bunch of results. So I don't necessarily know which of these results is going to give me the answer that I want to know. So I'm just going to start clicking and see what I get here. So this first one is telling me total population in occupied housing. Well, that's not what I'm interested in. I wanted to know the total number of housing units. So let me try the next one. I'm just going to come down and try the next data set in the list. Okay, so this is giving me what I want. It's telling me here's the total housing units and here's the number that was occupied. So 2,700 occupied out of 3,000 total. That gives me the answer, right? Think this is great. A couple of things to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at this. It will always tell you up here what data source it's using to get this data from. So as you can see here, it's pulling from the ACS 5-year estimate. And that's the only choice that it's giving me because it's not available in some other source for this particular table. There may be another table. I may be able to pull it from this table instead. So this one reported it to me as a percentage instead of a number. So you can kind of play around, see what you find, see, you know, sometimes you'll have additional data sources. So like if it was if I'd picked City of Raleigh, they would have had a 1-year estimate as well as a 5-year estimate because they're larger than 65,000. But because I picked Siler City, which is smaller than 65,000, I only have the 5-year estimates. But that just gives you kind of a quick idea of how the site works. The other thing that you'll see in here that is really, really handy is if you just type in really any geography into the search bar, it will give you an option to pull up what they call the profile. And the profile is really great at giving you a snapshot of sort of current data on whatever that geography is. So here's Siler City's profile. It gives me all kinds of information here about total housing units, household income, how many people don't have health coverage. And then there's a whole slew of data down below that I can go through, or I can click over here on the left and it'll take me right to the section I'm interested in. And this is a really, really easy grab to go and find quick data. So all you really need to do is just type, I'm going to type Aberdeen, and it gives me Aberdeen's profile. So it's a really great tool. I highly recommend that you take advantage of it. Okay, so moving on to non-census stuff. We also have the North Carolina Office of State Budget and Management, which has the State Demographer's Office. They also develop annual estimates of state, county, and municipal population. The key thing that we get from OSBM that we do not get from the census is projections of future growth. So the State Demographer does develop 20-year projections of future growth for the counties in North Carolina. The OSBM is also responsible for maintaining the State Data Center program and the LINK portal. So the LINK is basically OSBM's version of data.census.gov. It's a very similar kind of thing where you can go in and search and find various information. So another great tool for specifically within North Carolina. And then moving on to talk about some of the GIS data that's available out there. There's a site called NC1 Map. And I'm going to tell you that just to be personally blunt, I used to hate the NC1 Map site. It was a terrible website. It was so hard to use. You couldn't find what you were looking for. It was a mess. Thankfully, somebody has gone through and completely redesigned that site. And this is a site that, frankly, I had given up on using a couple of years ago. But when I was putting this presentation together, I said, I really ought to talk about NC1 Map. Let me go, I'll pull it and I'll look at it. And I was so blown away by the improvements they have made to that site. So it is great. You can go into that site, search for whatever type of GIS layer you're looking for. And if they have it, it'll pop up. You can download them. You can put them in as a service layer in your GIS program. You can pull up a web map of that. It's so much easier to use than it used to be. So if you haven't looked at NC1 Map in a while, give it another look. It's greatly improved. And they are a great source of information on, they have some particular major projects that they maintain data for, such as statewide information on addressing. This is where you can find the broadband information. So they have, if you go to NC1 Map, they have a whole section that is mapping related to broadband. They also have aerial imagery for the state, parcel information, and stream information. So it's a great resource. And then another resource that I like to use for GIS data is NCDOT's GIS data portal. NCDOT has a surprisingly large amount of GIS data that is available, that's out there that you can use. And they've got a pretty easy to use website for being able to get that data. So I've got the link for that here as well. How are we doing on time, Elena?
You have about a little over 5 minutes. You have one question that I want to make sure you answer, and then quickly, so you probably have a quick answer to it. How accurate were the past estimates in growth from the state demographer?
That's a really hard question to answer. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest, but those estimates, those growth projections, well, so there's two questions. There's the estimates, which are done for like years between the census. So eventually they'll do a 2021 estimate, because we're between census years. But then there's also the projections where they'll look out 20 years in the future. And I would say, their estimates tend to be fairly decent estimates, but on projections, it really is, it's a hard thing to do. So the state demographer has a particular method that they use for doing their projections, and it's mainly based on how much you've grown in the past, and then sort of extrapolating that out to the future. So if you are in a community where you're kind of on the cusp of a big growth spurt, those projections may not be great, because if you haven't had a whole lot of growth in the past, they're probably not going to be showing a whole lot of growth for the future. It's going to kind of vary from community to community. Real quickly, a couple of caveats when you're working with data. Obviously, different data sources are going to give you different answers to the same question. So there's a lot of things you need to think about. So think about how new versus old the data is. Think about whether it's count data versus sample data and what the margin of error is on that data. Whether the data might even be available, how close are you to the sort of minimum thresholds? Is that going to be data you can even get? Think about the reputation of the source you're using. So if you wanted to pull population data, would you go to the Census Bureau for that, or would you go to Wikipedia for that? I'd probably go to the Census Bureau. Although, even though Wikipedia probably has the same number, I'd rather go to the Census Bureau and make sure I'm getting the right number. And then how you word the question you're looking into really makes a difference. There's so many nuances in how the data gets divided up into different groups. So for example, did you know that there's a difference between getting information on households versus getting information on family households? Or how are you defining working age population versus adult? Because census says working age starts at 16. So that's different from adult. Adult starts at 18. All of those types of questions. And on the left, you can kind of see an example of what that looks like. If you just ask the simple question, what was Wake County's 2010 population? Depending on which data source you look at, you can come up with 6 different answers here. So you've got to kind of weigh which one is most appropriate for the analysis that you're doing. And most of the time, that's going to be that straight up decennial census number. But sometimes, depending on the analysis you're doing, one of those other numbers may be the more accurate number to use. We're going to skip the exercise since we don't have time. But I do want to end on this slide, which is sort of what Triangle J is doing related to data. We are here to help you with your data needs. We are a designated regional data center, so we do have a responsibility to help you all with accessing census data when you need help. We do also maintain a number of data sets for specific projects, so things like the Community Viz land use forecasting model that we maintain. We are also in the beginning stages of developing a web-based data hub where we hope to be able to share and organize data sets of interest for our region. That's just something that we're really excited about doing. And we have recently hired a data strategy coordinator, Adam Spillman, who I think is on here, who is going to be helping us to build that data hub and also working on what our organizational data strategy should be. So I believe that is the end of it. And I think we're right at time.
Yes, you did a perfect job. Are there any quick questions? I would say the best way to probably connect if you have a question is to email Matt with, his email's up on the screen, and Adam just put in the chat as well. You can similarly email him. They're both great resources. So thank you, Matt, for your presentation.